Welcome to this series of mini sessions on different aspects of trauma. The war in the Ukraine confronts us with many traumatic experiences. Us, I think many others, probably more than us. And the ones receiving them with a task to somehow create a space to help the wounded ones dealing with their experiences, or at least to make it not worse. These are tremendously stressful times for many, most of all for people affected directly with the unimaginable. I'm Thomas Bucher. I'm the General Secretary of the European Evangelical Alliance. Welcome to this series, and I want to especially welcome the expert which we have among us today. And having been part of the leadership team of member care at European and global level for a number of years, Marion Knell instituted an MA in the subject at Redcliffe College. She now consults with Refugee Highway Partnership on care for refugees and refugee workers and leads trauma response for the EEA. Marion has developed courses for churches on working with traumatized refugees and sustaining refugee workers. She's an international speaker on staff care and works with an international relocation company as an intercultural trainer, both pre and post assignment. She has written 2 books, Families on the Move and Burn Up or Splash Down, the Survival Guide to Reentry. Marion, welcome to this series. And let me just ask you, how are you practically involved despite, apart from consulting? How are you practically involved in refugee trauma care?
Well, at the time of the evacuation of the Afghans, back in August the 15th, I think it was, they came. They've been coming to England, and a number have ended up in my town, which is Watford. So we have 400 plus Afghans scattered across 3 hotels here. They've been here since September, so you can begin to imagine what it's like with a family. Sounds lovely hotel. They're small hotels with sort of 2 beds to a room, and only about 10 families have actually been relocated. So we're now getting to the stage where mental health care for them, it's not the same as what we're talking about with Ukraine, where you're talking about immediate response. But for the people that I'm dealing with now, it's kind of long-term stress and mental health care that we're needing to provide for them.
Which actually leads us to our first section and first question on psychological first aid, because that's actually what many have to deal with. First aid, like somebody who has cut his finger. These people have deep bruises and cuts in their soul and in spirit. We've called this session psychological first aid. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yes, well, one definition that's come up is that psychological first aid is a humane, supportive response to a fellow human being who is suffering and who may need support. In other words, we're not talking about psychologists getting involved. We're talking that you're the person at the border, at the church when the person arrives. What can you do in that situation? And I think it's interesting that Michael Vessel said in a paper some long time ago, well-meaning but ignorant or unqualified people can do more harm than good. And we want to do good, not harm. And unfortunately, if we're ignorant, then we can inadvertently cause harm. So psychological first aid is, yes, literally the sticking plaster. What can we do till they get to another safer place where we can refer them on to something else? And I think it's all about, the first thing is about establishing a human connection. You know, most of these people have been through brutal stuff. So to find a human connection, someone who is compassionate, is important. We're trying to comfort them emotionally, enhance their sense of safety. You know, the world is not safe anymore. So enhance the sense of safety, calm and orientate the distraught. So I think really in terms of that first stage, we're helping survivors to tell you their immediate needs. Don't predict it, ask them what their needs are. Offering practical assistance, that may mean doing shopping, providing food, helping take care of the kids. connect survivors to the appropriate networks. You don't have to do everything, but when you're that first point, you're the person that can connect them to networks where they can help, places where they can get social and physical and emotional support. And we're trying to help them to adapt. I mean, this is their lives have been turned out upside down. So how can they adapt? How can we empower them to meet their needs? Provide information. There's all sorts of things they just won't know about crossing a border or two borders, but also be clear about your availability and links to others on the team. The danger, I think, is that people make themselves too available and then you create a dependency with someone. So I think it's really important to be working in a team. And if you have a phone, you pass it around the members of the team and just know your own limits. We know I'm not a professional trauma counsellor. So it's important we know our limits within that.
How do you actually know your limits?
Well, I think one of the things we're encouraging people to look at their own experience of trauma or their own resilience. I mean, resilience is a big buzzword these days, but it's really not a good idea for somebody who's got a repeated experience of trauma in their past to be dealing with a traumatized person, because they can end up being re-traumatized. So I think, you know, what are my limits? What is my experience? What skills do I have? I may have done something like an SYS course, a listening course. I know I'm a good listener. But I know that for people who are particularly empathetic or compassionate, it's easy for them to cross the line and actually become identified with the person who's experiencing the trauma. And then they enter into that and take it upon themselves. So, you know, really asking yourself, and also for people who are putting teams together, I think it's good to put a few questions together about, I mean, we're going to talk in a minute about trauma, but we use the word trauma so glibly in our Western society. You know, I had a traumatic week this week, you know, the car wouldn't start, the kid got sick at school and something else, you know, it's not trauma, but that tends to be where we're coming from when we view it.
Many volunteers will have never encountered a traumatized person. What are the basics they need to understand?
Well, I think, yes, I'm going to point you to some resources, because obviously in a time like this, there's only a limit to what we can do. But the first thing is to understand how this person has been affected by the trauma. Assumptions about safety have been destroyed. The world is no longer a safe place. Everything has been destroyed in that. Trust has been undermined. Who can I trust now? I thought I could trust my neighbor. I thought I could trust somebody else. There's nobody I can trust anymore except myself. Control. They no longer have control over their lives. And I think that's an important thing. You know, they didn't often have a choice about moving, a choice about where they're going to, or a choice indeed about the future. So there's lack of control. Intimacy can be difficult, and basic beliefs about the world have been changed. So I think it's really important that people take some time to sit where they sit and come through with their experiences, because we talk about this person arrives with trauma, but it's not just one. There's probably been a trauma in the place where they were settled, and then the journey itself is traumatic. You've only got to look to see the news about the people on the railway stations leaving Ukraine and arriving in Poland. So there's pre-departure trauma during the journey, and then the first place they land, it's not finished, is it? Because they don't know what lies ahead. So I think that's understanding those sort of big things. But I think also we have to understand what a trauma is. I'm sorry for some technical stuff here, but at least we'll try and ground ourselves a bit. So a trauma is a psychologically distressing event outside the range of usual human experience, something that we can't normally expect to experience, which causes damage or injury, either physically or psychologically, in response to some crisis or stress that needs repair. And there are 4 factors in what makes a trauma more traumatic. Firstly, we've already alluded to, is the degree of control we have over it. So if you've been involved in a tsunami, you had no control. The novelty of the event. Have I experienced anything like this before in my life? The lack of internal or external resources to handle it. Now, if we had longer, we'd go back to say how people handle trauma may depend on what situation their life was before it happened. Were they in a good place? Did they have lots of supportive relationships? Then there'll be better place to handle it. But what internal resources are there, and what external one? And the 4th one, I think, is crucial, is the degree of brute evil that's inherent in the event. So the worst sort of trauma is when somebody, a human being, inflicts the trauma on you. That's the most catastrophic one. And I think in terms of understanding the symptoms, I'm going to point you to 1 or 2 resources while we're here. If you haven't yet come up, you probably can't see this, can you? Mobile member care team. We'll send a list out, won't we, Thomas? Mobile member care team has a website with lots and lots of resources relating to various things, but particularly in trauma. So they've got common reactions to trauma in adults, teens, and children. So you can familiarize yourselves with the symptoms. I mean, things like anxiety, panic attacks, flashbacks. This is one that happens quite often and often leads to PTSD, depression, grief, inability to sleep, inability to make any sort of decisions. So knowing those kind of symptoms help, not just for our understanding, but to be able to normalize it for the person we're talking to. You can give reassurance and say, this is quite normal how you're feeling. You know, you are not abnormal. It's a situation that's not normal. And I think the 3rd thing to say is that we really have to understand what constitutes trauma in this culture. We have to understand the culture the refugee is coming from. How is it experienced? How is it processed? Is it processed on an individual level or within a group? What are the mechanisms for that? And of course, we've got issues then of translation. Have we got people who can translate for us? And we need to be careful who we choose to translate. Never ask children to translate for their parents, because you're ending up with them asking things or hearing things that they shouldn't. You know, what about eye contact? What about gender? What about age? How is all of that? Because we have our own ideas about how you handle trauma, but we really need to understand it within the cultural context.
Just to make everyone aware, we will come up with a list, or Marion will come up with a list of resources which we will post on the website. And you are also welcome to put questions into the chat box, and we will see if we get around to answer these questions at the end of the meeting. So why might refugees be unwilling to talk to us?
Okay. Now it follows on really from that last comment about culture, because depending how it's viewed in the culture will affect their ability to say it. So one reason they might not be willing to talk to you is they don't want to relive their experiences. This was so painful. Why would they want to talk to you about it again? Issues of trust. Can I trust you with my story, or is it going to go on to the newspaper tomorrow? Do you understand enough about me and where I'm coming from for me to be able to trust you? I think that's one thing we've learned being with the Afghans now for 5 months, is that we've built up an incredible amount of trust. And so we're getting a lot of deep sharing. But if you're on the border with Ukraine, you haven't got time to build trust. So there will be areas of trust. Avoidance of shame or stigma. In many cultures, experiencing a trauma, well, there must be something wrong with you if you've experienced it. You feel shame for having it, shame for not being able to protect your loved ones. There's all sorts of reasons why people may feel shame about experiencing trauma. I mean, actually, we can think about it even into our own past history of people sharing rape experiences. It was never done because it was shameful. So there's still a shame area. The belief that it's inappropriate to discuss it with strangers. This is my personal life and you're a stranger to me, so I might not. And then the last one is the effect of trauma on the ability to recall, follow a storyline or have concentration. You'll find people will say, oh, that person told me a lie because last time I spoke to them, they said this. This time they've said another set of things. But trauma actually impedes your ability to put a story together so you remember this bit and then you remember that bit. And that's why I think we have to be careful if we're talking to a group of refugees, because if you've got a group that came, you may be talking to them. And one person says something that happened during the trauma, and this person here wasn't aware of that, hadn't seen it. So suddenly here's another trauma coming into their lives because somebody shared their bit of the story. So it's kind of being aware of the effects of storytelling. And I think, you know, I'm very keen that we put supports in place if we're going to be listening to people. Confidentiality. They have to be able to trust us that their story stays with us. That we need to re-establish trust and reassure that we're not an authority figure. We're not going to report them or do anything. We're safe. Social support. Do they need, if they're with you, do they need a friend alongside to be present? And understand that talking about the trauma can be very, very painful and the person may be upset. And we have to be sure, realize that we can't solve their problems. We can't make their distress go away. We're going to have a lot of people involved in this sort of work who have like a messiah complex. They, you know, they can rush in to save the world or forget somebody's already done that. But, you know, just you can't make it better for them. So I think what we're trying to do is to put that confidentiality into place, and then we're normalizing it. Yes, these symptoms are quite normal. It's quite expected that you will feel like this, and your coping mechanisms aren't adequate. Helping them deal with their physical reactions, grief reactions, anger. We'll talk about anger later on, and their confusion. It's just that for most of those of you who are involved with the Ukrainian situation, they have left trauma behind. They have had trauma on the journey. They are still in trauma while they're in transit. So it's a very multiple layer thing, and actually just being that human person, that human contact when they first arrive is really important. Does that answer your question, do you think?
It does, yes, thank you very much, which leads actually very naturally to the next question. How can we help refugees to tell their stories in a safe way? Because apparently this is very important, that they are not re-traumatized or feel insecure, but actually that they feel in a safe place to tell their story.
Yeah. Now, of course, your location may influence what you can do here, but I think, again, we need to be aware of the danger of re-traumatization, that telling their story can activate it all over again. And yes, so be careful about interviews. But I think if you're going to talk with somebody, have a nice open, if you can, nice open space, friendly area. Very often the physical location will either put the person at rest or may actually trigger something else. So a nice open space. If they've been shut in a railway carriage, shut in a building, in an underground building, really helpful to have it in a room that's got a window. So you've got a sense of space outside. I think that's important. asking open questions. Don't ask leading questions. Just, what would you like to tell me? And as I said, I understand the impact on a group of details. I think with some of our folk, we've trained them in critical incident debriefing, because I think that's a model that can be adapted to the refugee situation. I mean, most soldiers, when they've come back, have had a CID debriefing. None of my Afghans have had anything like that. They've had no emotional and trauma support. But a CID debriefing gives you a little bit of structure as to how to help the person tell their story in a safe way. I don't know how many people on here are familiar with CID that is taught at the Bucher. I'm pretty sure that Member Care Radio's got some stuff on it, but that's a whole topic that we might cover. And remember, it's not counselling. It's not an opportunity for you to satisfy your curiosity or have a good story to tell when you go back to your church, or an opportunity to gather information. So I think in terms of do's and don'ts, find a safe place to talk away from physical danger, if that's possible, and onlookers and the media. Listen to people who share their stories as many times as necessary. You're going to get through to the place where you want to ground them in a new place, but at the beginning, it may be several times. Listen to people's self-critical comments without judgment. There's a lot of survivor guilt going on here that you're going to have to deal with. Do not force people to share their stories with you, especially very personal details, if they don't want to talk. We're going to do some more do's and don'ts later on, but don't interrupt or offer examples from your own life, and don't tend to talk about yourself. You're not there to talk about yourself. You're there to listen to them. And don't tell them what they should be thinking, feeling, or doing, or give empty reassurances such as, oh, it's okay, everything will be okay, or at least you survived. That is no comfort to somebody who's left behind a loved one that died. So, I think those are the do's and don'ts. And the other thing I would say, because we're talking about, if you want, amateur, non-professional intervention here, it really is helpful if people, again, you can get it from the MMCT site, know the symptoms of when someone is displaying severe disturbance and needs mental health, needs proper psychiatric health, when people become very agitated or anxious when they're talking, their previous history of trauma, or if you have no mental health worker available. Here we're fortunate, we can talk to folk, and I've got counsellors available that I can bring in. When you're on the border, that's not likely. It's extremely unlikely, I think. So be careful how far you go with the story. I think. I mean, we're not doing anything about Ukrainian culture today, but obviously that's going to influence everything that I'm saying.
Can you list some do's and don'ts of providing PFA? And by the way, PFA is psychological first aid.
Well, I wanted to, again, it's on the website, the EA website of resources. We have this, again, you're not going to be able to see it, I don't, but it's called Understanding PFAs. It's got PFA on it. And it's a booklet put together by the World Health Organization that's in about 6-7 languages or more. I mean, the only thing I disagree with them is that they say debriefing isn't effective. The studies on debriefing that have shown that if it's done properly, it's very effective. Anyway, so PFO is a really good little handbook, Understanding PFA, that I would do with a team, because it's very practical. It's not got, dense print or whatever. That's a really good place to start. So do's and don'ts. Okay, right. Be compassionate and caring, even if people are angry or demanding. We're being tested at the moment with that, because, we've got people going stir crazy in a hotel, and that makes you irritable, and it's a short stage to being angry. They haven't been angry with us, but I can understand why that is. Try to put yourself in their shoes. Do try to help people contact each other, to contact others through the post or making telephone calls for them. And this sounds very hard to do, but it's really important. Do encourage them to limit their exposure to media coverage of the event. The problem with mobile phones now is that everybody's on all the time and can see the latest event. If you know somebody well enough, you might offer to keep track of the news for them and inform them of important information so they don't feel they have to be on it every minute. I've seen children with mum's phones attack it, and we haven't even talked about children, because children trauma is another whole topic that we could do something on. Do engage and assist people in meeting their own needs. You know, empowerment is a big thing in this, because you've become dependent on others, and that's really quite tough when you've been very sort of self-sufficient. So how can they meet their own needs? Find out where the government and non-governmental services are located and direct them to the appropriate services available in the area. So somebody on the team should be finding out, where do I go for this? Where can I direct this person to? Don't do it all yourself, but build good relationships with the other agencies that are around. Understand the emotions of the people who have suffered great loss, take them seriously. I think acknowledge their achievements, acknowledge little steps, because at the moment it seems they can't do anything. We talked about control, but sometimes it's hard to see that things are improving. And you may need to point out to somebody they've achieved a little goal, whatever that may be, getting their child to eat, maybe because they haven't eaten over the last few days because of stress. But little steps should be celebrated. And if they don't want to talk to you, you can still show your support by spending time with them. It's the presence that so often is important, the being there and doing practical things to help. Let them alone. If they need to be alone for a while, that's fine. But encourage them to have some company each day rather than becoming isolated, because that's not a good thing. Do not get in the way of emergency personnel that are trying to do things. Don't make promises you can't keep. Remember, their trust is shattered. It's not going to be helped if you make promises that you can't keep. Don't tell people why you think they're suffering, and don't cite reasons related to their personal behaviours or beliefs. Don't tell them what they should have done in a crisis situation like this. And don't criticise the existing services that are being carried out, especially in front of the people who need them. Support the service providers and try and make the services better. Yeah, I think they're the do's and don'ts. Just again, beware of triggers that will re-traumatize them. You know, our senses are triggered by sometimes a smell, and that recalls, you know, I was here when I smelt that. Taste, visual, strong emotions being developed. And what we're really trying to do is to ground people, to get them into the present reality. The present reality is that they are safe. Well, are they? That's the question. But we're trying to reestablish that grounding of safety, and help them to imagine the world as a safe place. So we reduce the size of the trigger. Again, we can't do anything about it today, but the whole issue of unaccompanied minors is huge within this context. But I say we can't do that today.
Thank you. We are now boring down on some real hard stuff. Questions about loss, death, and disappearance. What are the main emotions refugees arrive with? Okay, well, I would like everybody just to spend a moment thinking for themselves. If you were in a session with me, you'd be shouting these out, because we've got to. Can we put them in the chat box? Is that all right? Does anybody want to put in the chat? What do you think the emotions that people have in the when they arrive? Don't take too long, or otherwise we won't get it.
Anger, frustration, anger, yeah. Confusion, fear, disorientation. They're all negative emotions. Any positive emotions likely? Relief, helplessness. Yep. Yep. I mean, it's a real mixed bag of emotions that they come with. Yes, relief, loss, and grief. We haven't got grief. Have we got grief down there? But grief will be a very predominating emotion, often expressed, of course, in anger. Vulnerability, anxiety. I mean, things haven't finished because I've actually crossed the border, have they? You know, what is next? Where do I go next? Confusion. I think somebody said confusion. Hope, you know, but also despair. You've got these warring emotions that are going on because of, often too they're experiencing family conflict because of decisions that were made. Did the family all buy into it? So all of those things: relief, loss, anxiety, confusion, insecurity, family conflict, grief, hope, despair, anger.
Can you describe the nature of their losses?
Yes, again, you can think of this for yourself, but we always think of it in terms of people, but there's loss of place. The place has gone. It doesn't exist anymore. My memories are gone. My memories were associated with this family home. It's gone, or my town. There's loss of community. Many are killed. Those that aren't killed are scattered. Loss of loved ones, and therefore of relationships, parents, families, neighbors, huge losses within that. Loss of community and support systems. You know, who was there for you? Well, it was my neighbors. It was the community I lived in. If you're a very community-based society. Loss of career and purpose. I was which actually leads into status as well. You know, I was a doctor, I was a teacher, now I'm somebody on the run. We've already referred to loss of security and trust. Loss of religious rights. People often have, I mean, we notice it with the Afghans because Islam is a very formal religion. There were places where they had places of personal connection to God. So what about people coming from Ukraine? You know, their church was often a very important part of their connection to God. Loss of language. Nobody speaks my language here. And a lot of our identity is caught up in our language. Loss of finance. How am I going to provide for my family? I have nothing. Loss of identity and status. You know, the woman who comes with her children and leaves a husband behind. Is she still a wife? Am I a widow? I don't know. I've lost my identity in that move. And I think probably many people are familiar with the Kubler-Ross model of grief, the 5 stages. Again, we haven't got time for a teaching session, but 5 stages of grief. Denial, where people are in denial of the event that it happens. It's usually quite a short one, but this can't be happening. The second stage is anger. People often get stuck in the anger because it's, Joan Rivers once said, it's easier to be angry than to grieve, which is why we find a lot of anger. And it might be anger at themselves, anger at others. It might be taken out on others. Then the third stage is bargaining, when you try and think about ways that I might get out of this situation. Okay, if I do this now, then perhaps I'll get this then. That bargaining. And then fourth is depression, where people feel sadness, fear, and regret because nothing's getting any better, and that will affect their energy, motivation, until you get to the end of the curve when you're at acceptance, where people realize that this is the new reality and how do I move on from that. So yeah, huge. I mean, loss is just a huge issue.
Yeah, what should volunteers be aware of to help people coping with grief then, and loss?
Well, I think again, you need to know culturally, how do people express grief in this culture? I think that is, I mean, a lot of cultures, and I think the Ukrainian one would be one as well, is you grieve together. You don't grieve on your own. You spend time with others. We tend to go into denial and be very, certainly as Brits anyway, it's a very personal thing. But finding ways, finding rituals, ways in which finding small rituals, maybe prayers or whatever, that help them to work through the grief. Again, it's part of the storytelling, is normalizing it, because people often don't realize that what I'm feeling now is not just anger, but actually it is grief, and it's much more healthy to grieve than to be angry. So yeah, it's most of it, I think, is the being with, is a sense of presence, being with people.
You have said that some of the losses relate to death, but sometimes people disappear or are lost en route.
Yes. Yeah, I think this is quite a critical thing, actually, that there's a big difference between death and disappearance. So death, it's awful, but you have evidence that something's happened. You know what has happened. There are social and religious norms for dealing with death. You know, we have funerals, we have wakes, we have whatever. There's the rituals that are associated with that. There's a clear outcome. This relationship has ended because the person is not there anymore to have the relationship with. And so actually people have got permission to start the grieving process. Permission to take up a new social role, because I cannot be this. I'm not a daughter anymore because my parents have died. I'm not a wife because my husband has died. And there's no stigma attached to death, because death is part of life. We accept at some point we will all die. Whereas disappearance, you've got no evidence of death or life. You're in that complete uncertain place. There are no social or religious norms or rituals to deal with disappearance. I think in England you have to wait for 7 years after someone was last heard of before you can kind of register yourself as something different. There's the uncertainty of the outcome. Do I grieve or do I hope? Where do I sit in that spectrum? All I've got is open questions and no answers, and nobody can give me an answer because it's a disappearance. It's an ambiguous situation. Do I wait? Do I search for them, or do I move on? What is my social role? And the possibility of isolation and stigmatization. So it affects you at 3 levels, really. The community will react to disappearance in a different way. Sometimes they will ostracize the person because they don't know where they fit anymore. They don't fit anymore. They might avoid the person because of that. And then within the family, it can be quite contentious because there can be disagreements over the fate of the missing person. And how does the survivor handle that? You know, some people will say, well, you know, you've got to continue as if you're married to this person, even though it's highly unlikely that he survived. You have to do that. There's a desire to retain the memory of this person, but actually, is that because he's gone or because we want to be able to welcome him back? But it can be quite fractious within a family. And then the individual, of course, swings between hope and despair, between guilt and self-accusation, is often quite emotionally isolated within this, and often refuses to accept the loss. So with that, we're trying, I think, with people who are in that situation, because you're going to ask me what we're going to do. We're trying to help them restore attachment and connection to others. They've lost this attachment, but that doesn't mean to say they have to lose attachment and a social meaning altogether. So find new places of being attachment, and find people who can help emotional support and care and overcoming grief and loss. So we might actually be talking about bereavement counsellors if we were in a settled situation. But again, the situation we've got at the moment with our Ukrainians is just too messy to be talking about that. But I think that's a really tough one, because sometimes the community won't want you to talk about it because it's shameful that this should have happened to you. But you need to talk about it. You need to face the reality. It's a really, really tough one, I think.
What might be the implications be of someone disappearing?
I think I've probably referred to most of that in that last section, that it affects you on an individual, a family, and a community level. Now it depends whether people are resettling within their own community. I mean, for instance, my Afghans in the hotel, they're in a very much an Afghan community, an Afghan reality still. Whereas I'm not sure that's going to happen with the current crisis in Europe. It will depend. It will depend on how much they and how much. It's how much information gets through too from the source where they came from. I think information is going to be a huge thing in this, in terms of helping people to cope with that.
Yeah, thank you. Marion, let's just turn to the questions which were posted in the chat.
Yeah.
In the Netherlands, there is a huge response to white Ukrainian refugees. They are so much like ourselves. For refugees from other countries, Middle East, North Africa, that is sometimes hard to understand. How could you help people to understand that there are cultural differences, and that they should not just take it for granted just because the skin color is the same, that people are wired the same way?
Yes. I don't know how many people here will be familiar with the culture iceberg, which talks about, most of culture that is what you could, a little bit of culture is what you can see, taste, smell, but 70% of culture is unseen. It's beneath the surface of the iceberg. It's all about our assumptions, our values, and all that sort of thing. And I found it very helpful some little time ago when I came across somebody who'd inverted the iceberg and said, let's find out what we have in common with people, and then you go down to the places where we're different. So I think we start off with our common humanity. How did God make us? What are our needs? What describes us? What is our identity? If you start off with your common humanity, then in a sense, it doesn't matter what language you speak, what color your skin is at all. There's a commonality in there. So I think, I've done some stuff on this for third culture kids, but looking at what defines us as human, what unites us as human, and then you take it down to the points where we actually, how we express those needs or how we meet those needs will be different. But I think we have to come out of our national kind of little bubbles and see ourselves as humans. I mean, I think actually the Ukraine situation in some ways has helped that, because we're not seeing people coming from a place that was poor beforehand or in famine or whatever. These are people just like you and me who had a nice home, who had a job, who had a church, had a family, all of which is gone. So it should be easier for us to put ourselves in their shoes, and it shouldn't, in that sense, make a difference what color there is.
Would the same principles which you have explained to us now, would they apply in supporting staff who have been working at the border receiving refugees as well?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, that's the other side of the equation, is that, but I think for staff, they need to be aware of the whole concept of vicarious trauma. They've got to be careful about what they listen to, or they will become traumatized and then they will do more harm than good to the refugees. They need to avoid burnout. I think when the demand is so, I talked about the Messiah complex, when the demand is so great, it's so hard. I think Elliot Ockman says in her article, it's so hard to shut the door and go to bed when, there's thousands of people on the other side of the door. But the fact is that if staff are not disciplined in self-care, in having good time, having a day off a week, going to sleep, then they're the ones that will burn out, and there'll be nobody to help the refugees. So that they don't help anybody if they work themselves into the ground. So yeah. Oh, the other site I wanted to recommend to people is the Headington Institute. It is on our resource list. It's an institute in Oxford that has reading resources. So you can do a course there on trauma and critical incidents. You can do one on vicarious trauma and burnout. I mean, you can even sign yourself a certificate, but it's a really good resource and it's all free.
Thank you very much, Marion, for this very enlightening, very helpful conversation. And that was really very helpful. I think it's going to be beneficial to many who are going to listen to see what you have brought to us within this hour. A rich bouquet of flowers, which hopefully will be a good smell to many and help many who need that so desperately. Thank you so much.